Welcome to She is Resilient, a podcast for women on their healing journeys who are ready to start living their most authentic and empowered lives outside of survival mode. I'm your host, Tatiana, trauma and somatic therapist, as well as a holistic coach, and I'm on a mission to help more women heal their nervous systems. Each week, me and my guests are going to get real and vulnerable about the experiences that led us to becoming the empowered and resilient women we are today. You'll leave this podcast with the skills, knowledge, and inspiration to start creating the life you deserve. Because if another woman can do it, so can you. Welcome back to another episode of She is Resilient. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Yanira Hernandez, who is going to be sharing a little bit about her healing journey. So, Yanira, do you want to share with us a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living?
Yeah. Hi, Tatiana. So thank you so much for having me here. Really, really excited. So yes, my name is Dr. Yanira Hernandez. I am a licensed clinical social worker and I am a therapist. I'm a bilingual therapist. And sometimes I want to say trilingual if you include Spanglish.
Uh,
Yeah. And and I work primarily with a lot of the first gen Latina population. I think that for a very long time, I worked with children and adolescents in many different type of settings. But my true calling, I felt like it was working with the first gen population. I think like for many of us who are first gen, we resonate so much with the population. We see that there's a huge need, right? So it's particularly with the Latina BIPOC population, I think that's where I find myself just feeling more powerful and more inclined to want to support and just yeah, just overall supporting my clients. And so I do therapy, but I also do I do coaching as well. I coach Latina professionals, first gen Latina professionals who are trying to navigate mental health systems because it's very rough out there, and sometimes we think that the only thing we can do is individual therapy, and that's not true. There's so many avenues that we can take, and I feel that we're so powerful, right? And our skills can be easily transferable in so many things. So I love coaching that population particularly as well. I also do immigration evaluations for our folks that are undocumented. And I'll share a little bit about my story in regards to that too, that led me to want to do this type of work with the undocumented community. And I also do speaking engagements. So I also do a lot of trainings in school settings or just in different organizations regarding different topics. But that's another passion that I feel like it's growing, doing a lot of the speaking engagements and just being able to show up authentically when I am in different spaces, professional spaces too. So that's been also a wonderful journey that I've been navigating.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. You're wearing so many different hats, but they're all very important hats.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here. So, this podcast is all about sharing our vulnerabilities and our healing journeys, and really what led us to become the empowered women we are today. So, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your healing journey and really what led you to become the empowered woman who can wear all of these hats today.
Yeah, absolutely. Oof, that's such a very intricate question. I think for me, for context, I grew up in a very traditional Mexican Catholic household in South Central Los Angeles. So, for folks who are not familiar with South Central, with a lot of community violence, and just a lot of under resource. And part of it, it's true. There's some truth to that, but there's also a lot of beauty in South Central. Unfortunately, it's predominantly Black and brown families here. So I grew up around my neighbors, I grew up around a lot of like Black friends, a lot of Latino friends. So it was very, I guess, diverse within us, right? So growing up in a traditional Mexican family household for me was that I grew up with a lot of traditional cultural views, and especially being the eldest. For folks who are the eldest, probably can resonate with a lot of feeling like you're the responsible one, right? And I have a younger brother. So oftentimes my parents would work long hours and I had to take care of him. I had to make sure he was okay, right? So very early on, I started receiving messages about uh, who I am as a daughter. Like
Mm.
I have to be the responsible one. I have to make sure everything is done perfectly. And perfectly, I think it's something that's cultivated that core belief that I need to be perfect,
Mm-hmm.
right? So much is expected of me, then therefore there's no room for error,
Yeah.
And so growing up with that, really, I think really marked a lot of my core beliefs of how I need to operate and see the world. And for me, at such a very young age, I was, parentified, right? I took on so many roles as a parent, where not only this sense of responsibility, how to taking care of my brother, but also the home. But because my parents are undocumented, um, they worked long hours. And to this day, they're still undocumented. And because of that, I think that I've always carried the sense of additional responsibility that I have to make sure that my parents are going to be okay. I have to make sure everyone is going to be okay. Therefore, it's all up to me.
Yeah.
Right. And I've carried that ever since I was very young because I always heard my mom tell me, if immigration comes, it's you're the one to lead the family. Si viene la migra, it's up to you.
Mm-hmm.
Those words were always engraved in my mind of what I knew, that if something were to happen to my parents, it's really up to me.
Yeah.
So again, this belief that I am the responsible, that everything that I do is for my family.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
especially I was like, what, maybe I recall hearing these messages maybe when I was 7 years old. And the reason why I recall that particular age was because we went to Mexico. My parents are from Puebla, Mexico. So we went to Mexico for an emergency. My brother was very ill. And as you know, with a lot of undocumented immigrants, they have a lot of reservation when it comes to our healthcare system,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so my parents felt that if they went to Mexico, that my brother would get the appropriate care that he needed,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then the family went to Mexico, and on our journey back, obviously my parents couldn't cross the border, and so I think I recall being away from my parents for weeks,
Mm-hmm.
because they couldn't cross the border. So we stayed with like aunts and uncles. And I remember my mom on the phone telling me, like, hey, mija, like, you need to take care of your brother. You need to make sure he's okay. You need to do X, Y, and Z, right? And I'm 7,
Yeah.
I am 7.
Right.
I think I was like in second grade.
That's wild, right? Imagine
Yeah,
that huge responsibility, and you were only 7 years old. You were a
right.
baby.
Yeah. Now I think about when I look at 7-year-olds, I'm like, oh my God, they're babies, right? And
Yeah.
to think of like that, those messages were already being received. And again, I don't blame my parents because I think that this was all a result of, systemic racism and just kind of the politics that are in this country. Unfortunately, we got the tell of it, right? We were impacted in this way, right? And then through that, I think that I had to just really, I started internalizing this perfectionism, you know, um, identity, right? I recall that by the time I was in fourth grade, I remember vividly telling my mom, like, I need to be the number one reader in the class. I need to get all fours, because the fours was like in elementary, they scored you from 4, 3, 2, 1. So I was like, I need to get all fours, mom. Like, I need to make sure. But because I was also hearing my mom say, Mija, tienes que estudiar. You have to go to college. You have to do this. She has fifth grade level of education, so does my dad. So academia was always engraved. it was always ingrained in terms of like, you need to go to school, right? College is not an option. We didn't go to college, but it's definitely not going. It's not an option for you, right? So that is definitely something that those are the messages that as I continued on, after middle school and high school, I just carried with me. And I think it just exacerbated because other layers of life kept happening,
Mhm.
and I think that that was kind of the beginning of like who I started becoming, as
Yeah.
an adult.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you know what? Perfectionism really serves us, right? In certain areas of our lives, it really does serve us. And I think, especially in school or work, I think perfectionism can be a great thing to have, right? Because you do your work really well. However, it does start to take a toll on you. And so I'm curious to know how that perfectionism started to impact other areas of your life.
Yeah, so I think that I first noticed that perfectionism, like I said, I was growing up with this kind of belief that I needed to be perfect, right? I first realized that I being perfect, it was multi-layered. It was not only in academics, right? But it was also in me and who I was as a person, my character, right? And something that also I navigated during when I was in middle school, high school was sexual abuse trauma from a family member.
Mhm,
And I remember that I couldn't speak up about it, not only because it's very tabooed in the Latino culture, specifically in like traditional Mexican culture, right? Of like speaking up, right? But I felt like if I say something, I'm not perfect. I'm not this perfect daughter that I'm supposed to be,
mhm,
right? And I need to just suck it up and just focus in school and just continue to be that perfect daughter that my parents expect me to be, especially
mhm,
my mom.
mhm,
So I think that in that way, it also impacted me as how I started showing up. I started doing a lot of people pleasing, I am not advocating for myself at school, just kind of saying yes or just making sure like I had this, was cute and buen portada, behave well, obedient, right? That meant that I was perfect because
mhm,
I caused no drama, I caused no nothing, right? And even in high school, when I was navigating not only the transition of wanting to be like being this mini adult, but also wanting to have fun because I was adolescent, I felt like I couldn't enjoy myself as much because, you know, I had to uphold this perfect, daughter, identity that
mhm,
I would be so afraid to ask my parents for permission to hang out with friends or do other things that they were doing that is very much teenage like,
mhm. Totally.
and yeah, I just couldn't do that. So at this point, I'm like, okay, like being perfect also means like staying in your lane, don't say anything about anything. And
Mhm,
this is what it is, And then later, even I think it manifested even more when I went to college and like, I navigated everything else. But I think when I think about like my formative years, when I was younger and then like in my adolescence, how that identity also was very much like is also about my character and how I show up in the world. And that means I gotta shut up.
mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I feel like that's so common, especially with girls and women, right? Like
Mhm.
we are taught to be small and obedient and right, like we are kind of trained to be people pleasers. So
Absolutely.
it is really common, and I'm curious to know if at that time you knew that you were people pleasing, or if you knew that you were sort of this perfectionist, or is it more of something that you learned about yourself as you went into your healing journey?
I had no idea that I was being a perfectionist. I had no idea that I was people pleasing.
Mhm.
There weren't even words that I knew that I could contextualize my experience.
Yeah.
I thought this was normal. I thought
Mhm.
this was a normal experience for a girl from the hood, who grew up with traditional Mexican strict parents. I
Mhm.
thought that was a very normal experience. I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, everybody listens to their parents, everybody listens, to, follows direction. And for those who didn't, I have friends who just kind of, would do other wild stuff, but for them, I always perceived it as like they're just being kind of malcriados, right? They're being
Mhm.
just bad kids.
Yeah.
That's how I was interpreting it,
Mhm.
right? I was interpreting it as like I'm being a good daughter because I have good grades, I have the 4.0, I'm
Mhm.
saying yes to everything. So that's how I was internalizing too. And
Yeah.
like not speaking up about my own personal experiences because I feel like that brought shame to my family. And I said, okay, we're not rocking the boat here. I
Mhm.
was taught to not rock the boat,
Mhm.
right? I didn't understand these concepts until I started my healing journey. And I'm like, oh shit, this is people pleasing. This is me being a perfectionist. This is me operating on a very dysregulated nervous system.
Yeah.
Then I was able to contextualize, everything that I had experienced, which even that alone, that awareness was a whole journey in itself because it's kind of healing my inner child. And that's something that I continue to do because there's so many parts of me
Mhm.
that I still hold dear and I go on this kind of train of like, I wonder what would have happened had I done
Mhm.
this, had this been, available to me, had someone taught me about regulating my emotions and, not feeling stuck. I
Mhm.
constantly wonder that. But then again, then I go back and I said, okay, I didn't have the resources then. And
Mhm.
perfectionism was a way of for me to survive and for my
Yeah.
parents to teach me like, hey, this is survivalhood,
Mhm.
and we got to do what we got to do to make it here, especially considering their intersectionality, right, being undocumented,
Mhm.
coming from a very a rural place in
Mhm.
Mexico where those gender roles are very rigid,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Women are dedicated for the home and that's it, and the men are take care of finances, they work, so then I'm like, okay, it makes sense,
Yeah.
it's large, it's systemic when we really kind of step out of it. But I don't think that I knew what was I experiencing until not too long ago.
Yeah, 1000%. That makes so much sense. So I'm wondering if there was a moment in your life where you said to yourself or you realized, okay, this is no longer serving me. Was there a moment in your life?
I know the exact time, place, everything. I was not until my mid-20s when I really stepped into the role of healing. Because even when I went to college, you know, being first gen, going from South Central to a place like UCLA, where it's very different. I navigate a lot of the imposter phenomenon, right? I still think I was very much in survivalhood, where I was just trying to fake it till I made it, right? And then even right after college, I went to grad school. I got my master's in social work at USC. And even then, I felt like I did it because I was always inclined to want to help and serve others, right? But it was always in the context of like, I'm helping others, like other people have issues. I don't, I'm helping others. So that was kind of the mindset that I had when I first started my grad school and my overall, like my journey in social work and mental health, because I went straight from college to my master's, I was like, 21 when I started my grad school career. So I was still very young. So when I graduated from my master's and got my first big girl job and I'm start being, actually doing the work and seeing so many different cases, I worked for the county at this time. And, when you work with the county, you just know what you're getting. And I was seeing so many cases and, you know, uh, I found myself just feeling very activated. I'm like, something in me is just doesn't feel is very uncomfortable with certain clients, and I had felt some of that in grad school. I was getting exposed to the material, which that led my first time being in therapy, right? But because I felt like that their therapy experience when I was in grad school was very different because I felt I was with a therapist who didn't really understand my culture. So I found myself more kind of explaining my culture. So it was a little bit of different experience. So once I was in just kind of in the professional world, right, doing clients and, quote unquote, doing the work, that's when I felt something came up for me. I was like, and I remember vividly that I was getting trained in trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT.
Mhm.
And at this point, I'm working with children, adolescents, right? And we're doing a lot of like trauma narratives and all that. And I'm like, whoa, something is something is activating me and I don't know what it is. Right. And then I realized that I knew exactly what it was.
Mhm.
That it is, I was holding on to a part of my story, my trauma story that has not been processed, has not been told.
Mhm.
And I recall, you know, I think I started thinking about it more. I started more kind of these like somatic symptoms showing up more. And I remember when my mom, I remember vividly, I was 26. I remember I was talking to her and she was talking about this family member who was my perpetrator. And I think that that was just a rage in me came out that
Mhm.
I had never experienced before. I was just more internalizing, a lot of the emotions that would come up for me. But
Mhm.
when she was talking about this individual in such a positive way, it was kind of like, man, fuck this. Like,
Mhm.
let me tell you who this person is.
Mhm.
And I remember that vividly. And I told my mom like what had happened and everything. And her face was just like, oh my God, she was shocked. But the fact that she, one, believed me,
Mhm.
two, she was willing to hear me out and then even ask me who else is this happening with anybody else, she just started asking questions
Mhm.
and she just fully just supported me. She apologized for not she's like, I'm so sorry that you felt like you couldn't tell me before. So
Mhm.
just hearing those words, I
Yeah.
think, and just her holding space for me, it changed not only my relationship with my mom, but also I think that that's when I started doing a lot of my healing
Mm.
journey. I think that's what I would want to say, that that's when it started officially,
Yeah.
because I'm like, I can say, I can speak up about my experience. I
Yeah.
can share and people believe me. I can feel seen. If my mom was able to like believe me and see me, then anybody can. So I think that that's when I really want to say that that's when it officially I was able to really allow myself to go deeper and
Mhm.
just say, okay, this is something that I need to explore.
Mhm.
And I completely ripped the band-aid, and I'm willing to really clean the wound all the way in and allow to come out whatever needs to come out. But I remember
Wow.
it was that experience
Yeah.
that said, and I was in my mid 20s. I think
Yeah.
I was 26. Like I said, I remember very vividly when that happened.
Yeah.
And we were sitting in the living room, but yeah, I want to say that that's when it started, because after then I went back to therapy.
Mhm.
This time was a little bit different because I also started doing more, just kind of trying to work within like somatic, as opposed to me just talking about the experience,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and then just really learning what was coming up for me and the intersects of all of my identities and everything. And then I also work
Yeah.
with the Latina therapist. I feel like I felt more
Mhm.
understood. And I was also like finally dating someone serious at this time who is not my husband.
Mhm.
So I think so many things were happening at that time that just
Yeah.
really invited uh me to just, okay, we're on this journey now and there's no way coming back.
I love that. I love how healing that interaction was,
Mhm.
right? Something that we might sometimes see as small, right? But it was so powerful and so significant for your mom to respond in the way that she did. And that in itself was healing, right? And
Yeah.
it opened up the door for you to be able to go on and continue your healing journey. And I can relate with you so much in, I think and I'm sure a lot of therapists and even coaches and anybody else who's in this field can relate to us. We go into this field really wanting to help other people that we
Hmm.
really do forget about ourselves, right? And I think so often the clients that we end up working with kind of mirror back the things that we need to heal and
Hmm.
our unresolved wounds, right? And I think
Hmm.
it sounds like that's what happened in your case where you had this client that kind of triggered that in you. and that's how the healing journey started for you. I think that's
Yeah,
beautiful.
they're mighty. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that, and I think this is probably one of the first times that I've reflected like how meaningful that moment was. I've often reflected as like, oh, it was kind of the beginning of my like me sharing my like specifically my sexual abuse trauma. But I think now and like thinking about it and really sitting with it, it was like truly the beginning of just my entire healing journey.
Mhm,
Because even then, it I noticed how I showed up even differently in professional spaces
mhm.
because now I allowed myself the most intimate part of me is out,
Yeah.
and the most fragile thing is out there,
Mhm,
so if I'm able to reclaim this and show up authentically myself. And I think that was a beginning that I also started owning up the identity of being part of a mixed status family, being my parents being undocumented. For
mhm,
so long, I felt a lot of shame with that,
mhm,
because of, when I went to college, nobody really talked about being undocumented. It was more so like, oh, my parents are immigrants, but they're from here, they're from there. Nobody really would say it out loud being undocumented. And I feel like it was a very shame term, right? And of course, this is during the time where Obama's trying to get elected. It's like, there's a lot of politics that were happening during this time,
mhm,
right? So I think that that's the beginning where I started really processing what it really meant to be all of me,
mhm,
all of my identities that
mhm,
that have impacted, how I've navigated the world,
mhm,
and I recall that when I was at the county, because I was at the county for a very long time, I even started showing up more bravely, in our team meetings and just in like speaking up about clients and just wanting to advocate because it felt like a part of me had been sparked, that
mhm,
I'm like, now I will just want to advocate,
mhm,
because and fiercely advocate, because before I felt like I was advocating, but it was almost from coming from a place of like this like reservation. I was like, oh, kind of raising my hand, but not all the way through. Now I'm like, listen, y'all gonna hear me out, okay?
I
So
love that.
yeah, so then it was more so I felt like in so many ways, it just really allowed me to just lead into who I am. And I think even as I continue to do the work, right, there's moments where I've paused and I'm like, I think I'm better. And then life be lifing, and then another life event happens. And then I'm like, okay, I'm going back. I need to do something else.
Uh-huh.
Right. I think that has been some of the things that I have leaned into more so as especially as I continue to grow into my identities. Because another thing that happened crucial during this time, my mid-20s, I also got accepted to go back to school for my doctorate. And in that, I was also navigating feeling the imposter phenomenon. I was very young when I got admitted. I was like 26, 27, and the majority of folks were like in their mid 30s, 40s, and I'm like, oh man, like what is this little social worker going to contribute, when you had, other educators, that were there, just people who would seem who had a lot more experience, right? And for me, I think, again, going back to that pivotal moment with my mom, also kind of bringing that same energy at school, right?
Mhm,
I also started initially, I noticed the difference from the beginning to the end because I was initially just very quiet, just making sure I got all of my straight A's,
uh-huh,
I had perfect attendance,
uh-huh,
in my doctor program. Even if I was sick, I'm like, I can't miss, right? It's crazy to know that even carried on, like that same belief of like, I need to have perfect attendance. I need to have straight A's. I need to have 4.0. I continued to take that even into grad school, master's and doctorate,
mhm,
not into, and then towards the end where I was really working on my dissertation and I worked on a lot of what it meant to be resilient, especially for BIPOC, Latina students who have all these intersects, right, who were undocumented. And then so just really leaning into that and just how it also was coming up for me during this time too. I think
mhm,
that really changed the mark of like even my academic style, even the way that I was
Mhm.
writing. I
Mhm.
realized because I remember my dissertation chair, she was my initial draft, she was like, Yanira, I think something is missing here. Like, I don't know, go back. And I remember getting so frustrated. I'm like, what do you mean? I thought it was like perfect. I
Uh-huh.
was good to go. And I had, written pages and pages. And then I went back and she would like send me all these like articles and things to read and just like to allow me to really reflect. I'm like, oh shit. I'm like, I think I know what she's trying to get to. And I just started doing a lot more of the reflective work and just while I was doing therapy at this time. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm ready to just completely just put it all out there and just call out systems and call out all these things. Like, I don't care. And it just my voice changed. My
Mhm.
even my academic voice changed. And I
Yeah.
think that that's where I attribute to where I am now, where I really don't care to
Yep.
call out who I need to call out, really putting it out there, being authentically me. That
Yeah.
is where everything is rooted, where I felt like it was a rebirth for me, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. Isn't that so interesting how we try to be so perfect, right?
Hmm.
So that we can get that good grade or that people can like us or people can think that we're smart or whatever it is, right? We try to be so perfect, but that perfectionism, that trying to be perfect is really what prevents us from
Hmm.
actually being us, right?
Yeah.
From actually being human and authentic, right? And that moment when we decide to let go and surrender to that authenticity, to just really
Hmm.
say what we're truly thinking and feeling, that's where the magic happens.
Hmm.
And I'm so curious to know, I know that you talk about doing the work in therapy, but I really am curious to know what that work looked like for you and really what helped you get to that point where you could surrender to yourself a little bit and really access that authentic voice because I think it's so much easier said than done, right? Like I think we
Hmm.
we always tell everybody like be authentic, right? Just say what you're
Hmm.
thinking and feeling, but like how? How do we do that? So take us back to those moments in the work that you were doing in your therapy sessions, and what did that look like for you? How were you able to access that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and I think this is why also the first time I didn't feel like it worked for me because it was a lot of talking, it was a lot of talking therapy. And so not only that, but it was also, like I said, explaining like my culture and like felt like that felt exhausting. The second time around, I think that my therapist really challenged me and in a way that it felt gentle, but also really uh, inviting me to surrender and really looked inward and just coming. And I remember it took us a long time to come to a place of acceptance that all these experiences that have happened to me, because I think that because naturally, and I think that this happens for so many of us that are in have gone to school, college, or just have more awareness of like our mental health and the actual terminology, right? We tend to intellectualize everything,
Mhm.
and just think so cognitively. And that
Yeah.
was happening to me. I a lot of the things that I was understanding in therapy was very much like, okay, I couldn't understand it from a therapist point of view. And it was just so hard for me to get out of that therapist kind of mindset in therapy in the beginning you
Mhm.
know um and until she called me out, she's like, you're not here as Yanira the therapist, you're here as Yanira the human.
Mhm.
And yes, I know that you know what all these terminology means, right? I know that because you are a therapist and you did this work, but this is not the point. It's not the point that you tell me how much you know. It is about you actually just like, sit with what's coming up. This, we can name this experience, but sit with what's coming up and just allow yourself to feel and not just feel like, oftentimes we say like, oh, I feel okay. So we'll use we don't really name the feeling, right? We'll say the statement, what we
Yeah,
think, we
yeah.
say, I feel this, right?
Yeah. What
So
we think we feel.
what we think, yeah, exactly. So she like really pushed me to not only name the emotion, but also what's coming up in your body. And I think once I started doing the physiological and somatic work, if it was a game changer for me
Yes.
because I stopped intellectualizing a lot of my experiences, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of like these traumatic experiences that I had navigated growing up. It was very easy to me to be like, yeah, but I was a kid and this happened, like, I didn't know better. Yeah, blah, 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
But one is like, okay, I remember when I was describing this experience of me being very hyper vigilant and just always being cautious of my surrounding. And I think that that is also something that comes from living in the hood, right? I lived in South Central for so long, and having multiple experiences, not only myself, but also my family with like, being robbed or, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But also I had a very scary stalker experience.
Mm-hmm.
And in high school, which then activated a lot. I didn't know it then, but it activated a lot of the sexual abuse trauma that I've had prior. But I remember I had gone somewhere and I was explaining in therapy that I just felt so like I remember saying it vividly, my alarm system went off and I started experiencing this and I started experiencing that. And she was like, oh, no, 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 we're not gonna go there. I don't need you to tell me, this terminology words, right? And then
Yep.
intellectualize your experience. I want you to tell me exactly what you felt,
Mm-hmm.
and what was your body telling you? And, so then we started doing that and she worked through that. And I remember I was just crying,
Mm-hmm.
crying, and I just couldn't stop the tears.
Yeah.
And I remember I felt so vulnerable in that
Mm-hmm.
session. I felt so vulnerable because normally I would allow myself like a tear or two to just come out, but I
Mm-hmm.
kept it cute. I'm like, like I'm not gonna allow myself to like fully cry, right?
Uh-huh.
And then I think that's why this experience in therapy was so meaningful because she was willing to really take me there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just allow me to be human
Yeah.
and allow the space for the tears to come out and just really and tell me like what's coming up for you. Let's work through, what are you feeling? And like, I remember vividly, and I was like, what? This is maybe like, mm, I was like, what, 28, 29 maybe at this point,
Mm-hmm.
and she told me that, and I was like, this was a game changer for me because
Mm-hmm.
after our session, I felt like a huge weight
Yeah.
came, just lifted.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I try not to overthink about me crying, what that meant for me to cry in the therapy session because I
Yep.
was being so vulnerable, and I almost never allowed myself to be vulnerable. There was a lot of shame when it came to tears,
Mm-hmm.
and but just for her to do that and walk me and allow myself to like, okay. And then Shane, remember, she walked me through some exercises for me to kind of, stay. She's like, okay, we're gonna make sure that you stay within your window of tolerance.
Yep.
You're within your,
Uh-huh.
and then she was like, all right, cool. So it was just very it just changed the way that I even view therapy as a
Mm-hmm.
therapist,
Yeah.
because I remember after that's when like, okay, I was navigating through so much and I'm like, okay, I want private practice, but I want to train in EMDR, I want to train in all this, like different type of uh therapeutic models that we don't get trained in grad school, that we
Nope.
don't get trained when you are doing community mental health,
Yep.
right? And I said, man, they've been like keeping all these good stuff away from us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which I've been leaning more into wanting to do the mind body type of treatment modalities because
Mm-hmm.
I know from direct experience how different the difference that it made for me, but also like now that I do some of that work, the difference that it makes with my clients, and I
Yeah.
see it. I see it,
Yes.
So I think for me that's a vivid mark in terms
Mm-hmm.
of like how my healing journey also showed up in the therapy space,
Yeah.
and so that's why even with my clients too, I actually be like, especially, and I see a lot of therapists as well in my practice, and I'm like, okay, you're not the therapist here. I know you probably understand a lot of terminology, a lot
Yeah.
of the psycho ed that we're doing, but that's not the point, because
Totally.
I learned from my own experience,
Yeah.
so yeah.
1000%. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that you said that because really, when it comes down to actually doing the thing, right? Like we were talking about how do we access authenticity? How do we actually like access that part of us that can use our voice, right?
Right.
And it really comes down to feeling. And
Yes.
that's why somatic healing is so powerful because we can, like you said, intellectualize all we want. We can talk about our experiences all we want, but the true healing happens when you connect with your body and you can
Right.
actually heal your nervous system through that somatic healing because the nervous system only speaks through sensation, right? The nervous
Right.
system doesn't understand logic. So, and I talk about this on my podcast all the time. So, I think it's so important. I love hearing another person, right? Just kind of confirm that again of like, yeah, we have to feel. It doesn't, nothing actually changes until we connect with our bodies, right? And I had a very similar experience as well. Like, I talk about my experience in getting trained in somatic experiencing and how I knew all of the skills. I
Mhm.
understood my trauma. I understood why I was experiencing this. I had all the coping skills, but for some reason, I was still functioning from this state of fight or flight. I couldn't get rid of my anxiety, right? And it wasn't until I actually connected to my body that I was actually starting to heal my nervous system and things started to shift, right? And I think that does not only does it make us better humans, right? Daughters, partners,
Mhm.
friends,
Yeah.
right? Siblings, but it also helps us be better providers, right? Like when we can be fully connected, when we can
Right.
heal our wounds and we can
Mhm.
really help our clients feel
Oh,
more connected
yes.
and shift, right? So
Absolutely.
I love that you shared that with us. I'm curious to know if there were any other healing modalities that you did while you were on your healing journey, or was it mostly just therapy?
No, so actually, that's a very good question. So, as being coming from a traditional Mexican household, and us not really going to the doctor unless we really needed to, right? We leaned a lot on spirituality.
Mhm,
That's kind of the first form of healing that I was introduced to, very, very early on. So, in my mother's side, there's a long lineage of curanderas and just healers, that really stems from a lot of like indigenous practices, So I recall that anytime that during this time too, where I felt like very activated and I knew something was wrong, right? My mom, every time like I would share with my mom, like, Mom, like I don't feel too well, like something is up. Yeah, like I don't know, it's just like my mood, my energy. I also sought spirituality as a spiritual healer to support me
mhm,
also navigate all of this. And it's interesting because my healers would also name what I was experiencing, and I'm never gonna forget once I when I was I'm gonna go back to middle school because I remember I went to a healer curandera with I accompanied my mom, and my mom went, and then my mom was like, oh, well, can you also do a cleansing on my daughter? And actually, she told me, she was like, have you ever been sexually abused? And I was like, no, never, 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 and then my mom looked at me and I was like, no, never happened. And so we were like, okay, she got it wrong this time, but she knew,
yeah,
right? Because she was through my
wow.
cleansing. So then, years forward, this is something that I've always done and I continue to do,
Yeah,
because that's something that I'm very spiritual,
yeah,
right? And I believe on the energy that we have and how we can allow ourselves to also be in a space where our energy is received and not received. And I do think that that also impacts our mood. So anytime clients also say like, hey, I did different type of other modalities like Reiki, like I tried Reiki not too long ago, or they do, they go to a healer, an energy healer or curandera or get a limpia. And I'm
Mhm.
like, oh yes, that's amazing. Like when you do that and you combine it, I think it could be very beautiful. So those
Mhm.
are something else that I've always been doing. And then just more recently, I tried Reiki for the first time with a friend who's also a colleague,
Yeah, with Vidi,
Viridiana,
right? Yeah,
with
she was
Viri.
on the
Yeah.
podcast too. Yes, she's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, with Viri. So yeah, and it's interesting because again, because I'm so like energy, very inclined. I'm very intuitive.
Mhm.
And so a lot came up for me during that Reiki session. It was just, and after I left, I just felt so like relieved,
Yeah.
and I remember I processed with her after and I'm like, oh my God, I feel so relieved. And then after, and I kept having like even more experiences that followed up after that Reiki session.
Yeah.
So I do think that it's so important to sometimes just do what's best for you,
Yeah.
in your healing journey. And it could be very diverse, and that is okay because,
Yeah.
therapy is just one way we can heal, right? And there's
Mhm.
so many other ways that we can also heal,
Yeah.
and that's okay too. And
Mhm.
so which is why I also, like I said, and this is, I think this, I continue to do that, the healing through curanderas,
Yeah.
because I think it connects me to not only my culture, but also, my parents and ultimately my indigenous roots,
Mhm.
so that's something that I really hold dear. And, we've been doing it since we were, you know, very, very little. But I think
Mhm.
before there was a lot of shame
Yeah,
with anything that came up with curanderismo, because it was like you were seen being as like you're a witch or like you're
totally.
practicing evil things.
Yeah.
So I think now it's a little bit more accepting.
Mhm.
Um, so for a very long time, we never spoke about it. We just
Mhm.
were like, oh, I'm going to the doctor, but they didn't need to know what type of
100%.
doctor I was going to go see. you
Totally.
know, so then, but then, now I kind of share a little bit more openly with my friends too, because they also are starting to lean into that type of
Mhm.
healing practices too. So yeah.
Ugh, I love that so much. I totally agree. I feel like therapy is just one healing modality, and therapy is not the only way to heal. And I really want people to understand that because I think that so often people don't go into their healing journey because they think that therapy is the only way. And I think it's so important for us to spread awareness around all of the healing modalities that are out there and that people can really have access to. So I love that you're doing that. And I also think that healing, right? I always think about healing as like mind, body, soul. What are you doing for your mind?
Yes.
What are you doing for your body? What are you doing for your soul? So it doesn't have to
Yes.
be spirituality. It could be other things, right? But what are you doing for that soul? We all have a
Mm-hmm.
soul, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
want to ask you one last question before we go. You had talked about your dissertation and you said that you talked about resiliency. And so I am so curious to know, since this podcast is called She is Resilient, the word resilient gets such a bad rep. I think that so often people say, I don't want to be resilient, I don't want to be strong, but I really like to see resiliency through having a flexible nervous system. But I am so curious to know how you see resiliency and maybe tell us a little bit about what you wrote in your dissertation.
Yes, absolutely. So, specifically with resiliency, the way that I kind of researched it was I was looking at the resiliency of Latinx college students who have been previously bullied, and how and they may have had bullying experiences since childhood or in high school, and how it was impacting them now as college students. And one of the things that in my research is a lot of this resilience research was very based on kind of like a bounce back mentality. And a lot of it was more so kind of like it was operationalized in terms of like academia, right? How, and I saw this, working in schools, and like how oftentimes it's like, okay, if you go from like, you're able to go from like D's and F's, but now you have like A's and B's, like, oh my God, that student is resilient, or even in mental health, right? We have all these kind of different type of questionnaires that oftentimes, quantify a feeling, a mood, an experience, right? And there's also, questionnaires for resiliency, right? There's different type of scales. So depending on where you score, right, it can tell you how resilient you are, quote unquote. So a lot of the times, that's the research that I saw when it came to, because I specifically criticized the research on resilience when it comes to academic settings, particularly in K through 12 and higher education, and then also how the mental health, social work, psychology sees resiliency. And I looked at it through, again, because at this point, I was really all about calling out systems, and I still am, right? So I looked at it through critical race theory lenses, and just to really incorporate how our intersectionality, right? Resilience can look so differently depending on like our experiences, right? And just because I don't bounce back the way the world wants me to bounce back doesn't mean that I'm resilient. So one of the things that I saw in the interviews that I was doing with these college students was they came from many different, they were all Latinos, like Latinx, and some were undocumented, some had special education previously in the past. So maybe they were either diagnosed with like autism or had other learning disabilities. Some had a different like mental health issues, whether they had anxiety, depression, just different intersects that were happening. And a lot of them sometimes were like, I still have depression, and I'm just, I was able to get out of bed today and just go to school. I was just able to do that today. And like, that's as much as I could. And then they kind of reclaimed it as like, you know what, that makes me resilient. Just like, I still have depression. I am, I'm still trying to just go on a day to day, but hey, today I made it to school and that was a win. Right. For other students was like, hey, today I was able to finally speak to professors that I've been wanting to speak to, and, and just advocate for myself. And that to me was resilient. Another one was like, hey, like my family is, I've been able to just kind of show up more of myself, with my family, even though I still have anxiety. I still don't know what I want to do with my life as a college student, but hey, I'm able to just kind of show up, and be in this space with my family. And that makes me resilient. So it's just really, they redefined what resilient meant for them. And that's ultimately what it is. It's like we all can define what it means to be resilient, because I think resiliency has also been very much use, especially when we describe communities like BIPOC communities or disenfranchised communities, right? I was like, oh, you are resilient, So I think that's where a lot of the negative context may come from at times, right? It's like, damn, I don't want to be resilient, right? So at the same time, I think that we can all reclaim the term resilience, and it ultimately is up to us. It's not the way a questionnaire defines it or other people see us, like what we post on IG and like what we've been up to. No, we determine ourselves how resiliency looks like for us. And ultimately that's kind of the findings is like, being able to just redefine resiliency on your own terms, and especially the importance of that type of mentality being needed in academic settings, because oftentimes it's just based on grades, standardized test, like what you're doing as a career or whatnot, so it was really important for me to also to really highlight and honor those stories, because I do believe everyone is resilient, and every single person I interviewed, demonstrated that they are resilient. It's just not the way we are taught to see resiliency.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that was so good. I love that so much. And I think it's so true. Everyone is resilient. And I think it is those tiny shifts that we have from day to day, right? Like, and when we think about anxiety, for example, I still have anxiety, but I'm not at a 10, at a 2, right? And so it's
Mhm.
a different level, right? I'm still like you said, that student who was still feeling depressed, but they were able to make it to school, right? Like it's those little shifts that are significant and that show progress and, like you said, resiliency.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. So I think this is where like language is so important, right?
Mhm.
And I think now there's a shift in kind of uh forming language in a way that is inclusive and that is also just not putting the blame on the person, is that we're
Mhm.
just really calling out systems and just like ways that we have been conditioned to think. So which is why I really appreciate how this shift is coming into just how we see so many different aspects in many different fields, right? But like language is, it just really confirms the importance of language. Because even with ourselves, because the way, if I tell myself I'm not resilient, it's going to really impact me the way I show up in the world,
Mhm.
right? But it's like, no, I am resilient regardless of X, Y, and Z. It's going to completely shift the way that I see the world and I show up in my authenticity, right? We've been talking about, how do we show up authentically, and language is also part of it.
Mhm, 1000%. Oh, this was so
Yeah.
good. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and for sharing a little bit about your story. I know that so many women are going to resonate with you, so I appreciate you for being here and for sharing all of these gems with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tatiana. This was definitely such a healing space, just allowing me to share uh, pieces of me. And I really hope that, your guests can resonate, feel seen with, not only with my story, but just, pedacitos of what was shared, little pieces of what was shared today. And again, thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of you, inviting me. And yeah, thank you. Muchísimas gracias.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, so I have my website. So at www.bailantetherapy.com, or you can find me on Instagram, Bailante Therapy. I do a lot of content on many different things. So yeah, so they can definitely find me there.
Wonderful. And I will add that into the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you absolutely loved this episode, I would so appreciate it if you subscribed and left a review on Apple Podcast, or take a screenshot and share this episode on social media. Don't forget to tag me at tatiana.holistic.coach. The more nervous systems we reach, the more generational cycles we break, and the more we contribute to a kinder and safer world. And if you're looking for somatic healing services, send me a DM and I'd love to chat on how I can support you. I'll see you in the next episode.